The day we buried my daughter-in-law, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I remember the exact moment. The priest had just said her name, Lorraine, and I was standing at the graveside with my hands clasped in front of me, trying to hold myself together for my son's sake. The sun was low over the hills behind the cemetery. That pale winter sun you get in the Barossa in July. The kind that gives light but no warmth. My grandson was gripping my hand so tight I could feel each of his small knuckles. I almost ignored it. Who checks their phone at a graveside? But something made me pull it out. Maybe because I'd been expecting a call from my son's specialist. Maybe just because grief does strange things to a person's judgment. The message was from my son's number. He was standing 4 meters away from me, staring at the casket being lowered into the ground. I looked at him, then back at the phone. His hands were at his sides. He wasn't holding anything. The message read, "Dad, I need you to stay calm. Don't react. Don't tell anyone. I'll explain everything tonight. There's something you need to know about how Mum died." I put the phone back in my pocket. I stood through the rest of the service in a kind of fog. My son's name is Edward. He's 41 years old. He'd been married to Lorraine for 12 years. They had 2 children, my grandson Theo, who was 8, and my granddaughter Pippa, who had just turned 6. Lorraine had died of what the death certificate called a cardiac event. She was 39 years old. She'd been unwell for about 8 months before she died. Fatigue, mostly. Then the heart palpitations. Then a spell in hospital in March that the doctors put down to an undiagnosed arrhythmia. She'd come home with a bag full of medications and a list of instructions. And Edward had been managing her care since then. Lorraine and I had never been particularly close. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to the story. She was a pleasant enough woman, but there was always a distance between us. She had her world, and I had mine. When she got sick, I offered to help as much as I could cooking, picking up the kids, whatever Edward needed, but she preferred to manage things herself. Or rather, she preferred Edward to manage things. She leaned on him heavily. That part was hard to watch. After the burial, we went back to Edward's house in Nuriotpa. His sister, my daughter, had driven up from Adelaide, and she moved around the kitchen making tea and putting out food the neighbors had brought over. My grandson sat in front of the television, watching nothing in particular. My granddaughter had fallen asleep on the couch, still in her funeral dress, her patent leather shoes dangling off the edge of the cushion. I sat in the garden and waited. Edward came out around 9 o'clock. The kids were in bed. My daughter had gone to stay at a friend's place down the road. It was just the 2 of us. He sat in the chair across from me, and for a long moment he said nothing. He just looked at his hands. He looked like a man carrying something he'd been carrying for too long and didn't know how to put down. He said, "Dad, I think she was being poisoned." I didn't say anything. I don't mean I don't think it was random. I think someone was doing it deliberately, and I think I know who. I asked him to start from the beginning. He told me that about 3 weeks before Lorraine died, he'd found something in the medicine cabinet that shouldn't have been there. They kept her medications in a lockbox. The cardiologist had specifically recommended it because of the interaction risks. Edward had the key. But one afternoon he'd gone to restock the box and found an unfamiliar blister pack pushed to the back of the shelf behind it. No label, no packaging, just the pills themselves, a grayish-white color he didn't recognize. He'd photographed them and taken one to a pharmacist in a town 20 kilometers away, where nobody knew him. The pharmacist had looked at it for less than 30 seconds before telling Edward he shouldn't have it. It was digoxin, a heart medication. In the right dose, it regulates certain cardiac conditions. In the wrong dose or given to someone who doesn't need it, it causes exactly the kinds of symptoms Lorraine had been presenting with. I felt something shift in my chest. A cold, slow feeling. Edward said the pharmacist had asked him where he'd gotten it. He'd made up a story about finding it in an elderly relative's home. The pharmacist had told him to dispose of it and not to give it to anyone. He hadn't pressed further. Edward had gone home and sat with that information for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And in that time, Lorraine had died. I asked him why he hadn't gone to the police. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something between shame and exhaustion. Because I needed to be sure, he said. And because I wasn't sure I'd be believed. He told me then about the person he suspected. Her name was Gwendolyn. She was Lorraine's older sister. She had been a fixture in their household for the past 2 years since her own marriage had broken down and she'd moved back to the valley. She'd positioned herself as indispensable. She helped with the kids. She drove Lorraine to appointments. She organized the pantry and the medicine shelf and the shopping roster. She had access to everything. I asked Edward if he'd confronted her. He shook his head. She was here the night Lorraine died. She was the one who called the ambulance. She was the one who was holding Lorraine's hand. He looked out into the dark garden. She cried more than I did at the funeral today, Dad. I thought about that. I thought about the woman I'd watched weeping into a handkerchief at the graveside. The woman who'd organized the catering for the wake. The woman who'd made sure the flowers were the right kind and the order of service was printed correctly. Gwendolyn, who I'd always found a bit overwhelming, a bit too present, too helpful, too certain of her own importance in her sister's life. I asked Edward one more time. The text. The message you sent me. When did you send it? He looked at me. Dad, I didn't send you a text. The silence that followed was one of the stranger silences of my life. We sat there in the garden and worked through it together, speaking quietly. His phone had been in his coat pocket the entire service. He'd turned it off before we left for the cemetery that morning. He hadn't touched it. We looked at the message together. It had come from his number. But it had come from his number in a way that neither of us could explain. The next morning, I rang my son's mobile provider. I explained I was an authorized account holder. Edward had added me years ago for exactly this kind of practical situation, and I asked whether there had been any activity on the account. Any third-party access. Any linked devices. The woman on the line was helpful. She told me that approximately 6 months earlier, someone had added a secondary device to the account. A tablet. The IMEI number was different to Edward's phone. I asked if it was possible to send messages from that secondary device. She said yes. I thanked her and rang off. Then I sat at Edward's kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about what I knew and what I didn't know. I'm 67 years old. I spent 30 years working in insurance, not as a detective, not as anything glamorous, but as a man who read documents carefully and asked questions about inconsistencies. I know how to think through a problem without letting emotion run ahead of the evidence, what I knew. There was digoxin in the house that Edward hadn't put there. Lorraine had died of a cardiac event consistent with digoxin toxicity. Someone had access to Edward's mobile account and had used it to send me a message at the exact moment they would have known his attention was elsewhere. What I didn't know: who had added that secondary device, and why they had sent me that message. That second question bothered me the most. If Gwendolyn, if whoever had done this wanted to stay hidden, why send a message that pointed directly at the situation? Why set the whole thing in motion? I was still sitting with that question when Edward came downstairs and told me that Gwendolyn had called. She wanted to come over and help with the children that afternoon. I told Edward to let her come. He looked at me carefully. "What are you thinking, Dad?" I said. "I'm thinking someone wanted this to be found out. And I want to understand who and why before we do anything else." Gwendolyn arrived at 2 o'clock. She was a tall woman in her mid-40s, dark-haired like Lorraine had been, with the same way of moving through a space as if she owned it. She brought a casserole. She organized the children's afternoon tea. She spoke to Edward in a soft, solicitous voice about grief counseling and estate matters and what the children's school had said. I watched her the entire time. There was nothing in her manner that suggested guilt. That, in itself, told me something. After the children had gone to bed and Edward had excused himself to make some phone calls, I sat in the lounge with Gwendolyn, and I asked her about Lorraine's medications. She was happy to talk about it. She told me about the lockbox, about the schedule Edward kept, about the cardiologist's instructions. She was detailed and precise. She talked about how worried she'd been in those final weeks, how she'd been staying over most nights to help. I asked her, casually, whether she'd ever had to manage the medications herself when Edward wasn't home. She paused. Just for a moment, a few times, she said. Edward trusted me with the key. I nodded and said nothing more. That evening, after Gwendolyn had gone, I told Edward everything I'd worked out. I told him about the secondary device on his account. I told him about what Gwendolyn had just told me, that she had access to the lockbox. And then I told him my theory about the text message. I thought it had come from Lorraine. Not from beyond the grave, I'm a practical man. But from somewhere, Lorraine had set it up in advance. A scheduled message, a message she'd arranged to send at a particular time, to a particular person, in the event that something happened to her. Edward went very still. She knew, he said. I think she suspected, I said. I think she was frightened. And I think she didn't know who to trust. Not even you, maybe, at first. So she set up a device on your account. Something she could use without you knowing. And she wrote that message. And she scheduled it. I watched my son absorb that. I watched him understand that in the last weeks of her life, his wife had been afraid, and had reached out in the only way she could think of, to the one person she thought might be able to do something about it. She'd sent it to me. We went to the police the next morning. We brought the pharmacist's statement he'd kept a record when Edward had come in, because he'd been uneasy about the whole interaction and had noted it for exactly this kind of eventuality. We brought the phone records showing the secondary device. We brought a written account of everything Edward had observed over the preceding months. The detective who took our statement was a quiet, thorough woman who listened to everything without interrupting. When we finished, she asked 2 or 3 clarifying questions, and then told us she would need to speak to the coroner. The post-mortem had listed the cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia. Given the new information, a toxicology review was ordered. 3 weeks later, the results came back. Elevated digoxin levels, consistent with ongoing administration over a period of several weeks. Not consistent with any prescribed dosage Lorraine had been given. Gwendolyn was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon. Edward called me from his car, parked outside his office, voice barely steady. I drove up that same evening. In the weeks that followed, more came out. The police found the tablet at Gwendolyn's flat. They found internet searches. They found, and this was the part I found hardest to sit with, a life insurance policy. Lorraine had taken one out years ago, before the children were born. The beneficiary had been updated 18 months earlier. Gwendolyn had been the one to help her complete the paperwork. She had, apparently, helped her sister update the wrong line. The trial was 18 months later. I won't describe all of it, but I will say that I sat in that courtroom every single day. Gwendolyn was convicted of murder. She was sentenced to 22 years with a non-parole period of 16. On the last day of the trial, when the verdict was read, my grandson was at school. My granddaughter was at a friend's birthday party. Edward sat beside me, and when the word came guilty, he put his face in his hands, and I put my arm around him, and we sat like that for a long time in the emptying courtroom. He asked me later, when we were driving home, how I'd known what to do, what to look for, how to put it together. I told him I didn't know any more than he did, really. I just had 30 years of practice in looking at a situation and asking, what doesn't fit? What's the thing here that isn't where it should be? And then I told him the other thing. The thing I've been thinking about ever since. Lorraine knew. She knew something was happening to her. She was frightened. and she didn't know who she could trust. And she was in a house with her children, and a woman she'd loved her whole life, and a situation she couldn't quite make sense of. And in the middle of all of that, she found a way to reach out. She made a record. She set something in motion. She used the only tools she had. She saved her own children. Not her own life that she couldn't save. But she made sure it wouldn't go unanswered. That matters. I think about it a great deal. If you are in a situation where something feels wrong in your family, in your home, among the people closest to you, please trust that feeling. Write it down. Tell someone. Don't wait for certainty before you speak, because certainty sometimes comes too late. Lorraine's message reached me 20 minutes after we'd put her in the ground, and it was still enough. It was still in time for her children. The people who harm us most deeply are almost always the people we never expected it from. That's not a reason to live in suspicion. It's a reason to pay attention, to notice, to keep asking questions even when the answers are uncomfortable. And if you're an older person, a parent, a grandparent, someone who's lived long enough to know that the world is more complicated than it looks, don't underestimate what you carry. Your patience, your experience, your ability to sit quietly and observe before you act. These are not small things. Edward needed a lawyer, yes, and a detective, yes. But the first thing he needed was someone who would listen without panicking. Someone who would think. I'm 67 years old, and I thought I was past the age of being useful in a crisis. I was wrong about that. My granddaughter started year 2 this year. My grandson is in year 5. They live with Edward in the same house in Nuriutpa, and on Sundays I drive up and we have a roast, and the kids argue over the television remote, and Edward makes a pot of tea that's always slightly too strong, and it's not the life any of us would have chosen. But it's a life. Lorraine made that possible. I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful for a message I received at a graveside from a woman I never fully knew. It turns out there was more to her than I realized. I think that's often the case with people. We don't always see them clearly until it's too late. I hope her children know, when they're old enough to understand, that their mother was brave, that she was frightened, and she was in pain, and she still found a way to fight for them. That's the kind of person worth knowing. That's the kind of person worth remembering. If this story reached you wherever you are, whatever you're carrying today, thank you for listening. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far her story has traveled. I've been thinking a lot lately about the word consequences. Not in a heavy-handed way, just in the plain, honest sense of the word, that what we do ripples outward. And eventually those ripples come back. Gwendolyn spent 2 years building something she thought was invisible. She was patient. She was careful. She put herself exactly where she needed to be, and she made herself useful, and she smiled at every family gathering, and she wept at the graveside with what looked, to everyone watching, like genuine grief. And for a while, it worked. For a while, the plan held. But here's what she didn't account for. She didn't account for Lorraine, a woman who was frightened and in pain, who was watching herself get sicker and couldn't understand why, who didn't know who she could trust. That woman still found a way to act. She didn't have much. She had a tablet, an account she'd quietly set up, and the clear-eyed understanding that if something happened to her, someone needed to know. She didn't panic. She didn't confront anyone. She just quietly, carefully, made sure the truth had somewhere to go. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the crime, not the arrest, not the verdict, though all of that matters. And I'm glad justice was done. What I keep returning to is Lorraine sitting somewhere in her house, probably while the children were asleep, composing a message she hoped would never need to be sent, thinking through what she knew, thinking about who she trusted, deciding on me. That takes intelligence. Real intelligence, not the kind that scores well on tests, but the kind that works under pressure, that organizes itself when everything around it is falling apart. And it takes courage of a very particular sort. The courage to act when you're not certain, when you don't have proof, only instinct. When the person you suspect is someone you've loved your whole life. I think about that kind of courage often, especially now that I'm older and I watch the younger people around me navigate things that seem impossibly complicated. We don't talk enough about quiet courage, the kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside, the kind that doesn't get witnessed. What Gwendolyn did came from a place of want of greed, of resentment, of something that had likely been building for years. And the reason it unraveled wasn't luck. It was because the person she underestimated most was also the person who knew her best. You can deceive a stranger. It's much harder to deceive someone who has known you their entire life, even if that person is weakened, even if that person is frightened. Lorraine knew. She just needed time to act on what she knew, and in the end, she had just enough of it. I'm not a sentimental man. I don't say things I don't mean, and I don't dress up plain facts in language they don't need, but I will say this plainly. The most important thing I've learned from all of this is that integrity is not just a moral quality. It's a practical one. Lorraine's integrity, her refusal to simply accept what was happening to her, her insistence on leaving a record, on reaching out, on doing something even when she had almost nothing left, that integrity is the reason her children still have their father. The reason the truth came out. The reason I'm here telling this story. Pay attention to the people around you. Pay attention to the things that don't quite fit. And if something in your gut tells you that something is wrong, write it down. Tell someone. Don't wait until you're certain. Because certainty has a way of arriving just after the moment you needed it most. Lorraine didn't wait. And because she didn't, her children are all right. That's enough for me.